The northern wind howled across the timber palisade of the Roman frontier fort, carrying with it the scent of pine, damp earth, and something darker, the acrid tang of fear. Beyond the walls, the forest pressed close, its skeletal branches scratching at the night like the fingers of the restless dead. The sentry on the eastern watchtower pulled his cloak tighter, breath blooming in frozen clouds. His eyes flicked to the tree line. He told himself it was only the wind. But deep inside, Marcus Flavius, veteran of 2 Germanic campaigns, knew the signs. The horses had grown restless before dusk, stamping and snorting at shadows no Roman eye could see. The forest, once a mute barrier of oak and fir, seemed now alive with whispers. Somewhere out there, the northern men were watching. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his hand strayed again and again to the hilt of his gladius. At his side, a younger soldier, barely a man, shifted uneasily. "Sir, do you hear it?" the boy whispered. Marcus did not answer. He heard it, a low, rhythmic drumming carried by the wind, not the clash of steel yet, but the dull heartbeat of war boots trampling the frost-hardened earth. They came not with horns and banners, but with the hush of hunters closing on wounded prey. Then, from the blackness beneath the trees, a flicker of movement, silent shadows flitting between the trunks. The boy's breath hitched. Marcus raised his hand to quiet him. Too late. The first spear struck the boy's chest with a sound like a butcher's cleaver through a haunch of meat. He fell without a cry, the weight of him crashing into the tower's railing. Marcus lunged to the edge and froze. The forest was moving. Dozens of shapes slipped from the trees, wrapped in furs, helms crowned with the snarling heads of wolves. In the moonlight, he glimpsed what he dreaded most, the glint of blades that were not rough iron, but something else. Something that caught the pale light with an almost blue sheen. One of the shapes raised a sword. High Marcus saw the runes etched into the fuller, glimmering in the frozen dark, and then the raiders broke from the trees with a roar that seemed torn from the throat of a beast. Inside the fort, horns blared, soldiers stumbled from barracks half-armoured, clutching spears, curses freezing on their lips. Marcus descended the tower as arrows hissed overhead. He had survived the forests of Germania. He had bled for Caesar's eagles. But tonight, staring into the wild eyes of the Northmen, he knew he was not ready for this. The first Norseman slammed into the Roman shield wall like a charging bull. His blade carved through iron boss and flesh, as if neither were there. A Roman auxiliary screamed, then fell silent, his throat opened by steel cleaner than anything the Empire could forge. Marcus fought blindly. He raised his shield, parried, lunged, retreated. He saw the weapon up close, now longer than a gladius, double-edged, narrow at the point. But it was not the shape that chilled him, it was the shine. This was no crude tribal blade hammered from bog ore. This was something else. Something the Empire's own smiths had failed to copy, no matter how many blacksmiths they interrogated, bribed, or killed. The secret steel. The Ulfbert, the rumour whispered in the taverns at Lugdunum, in the smoky legionary camps along the Rhine. A blade so pure it bit Roman mail like cloth. A shout dragged Marcus back to the wall. Another wave came howling from the dark, more warriors in wolf pelts, the flash of perfect steel catching the moonlight like lightning. By dawn, the fort would be ash, the Roman eagle cast down in blood and snow, and in the forests to the north, the secret of the blade would slip back into the mist, carried by men who called no emperor master, only the cold gods of the fjords. Long before the word Viking would strike fear into the Christian kingdoms of the West, the Roman Empire ruled its vast frontiers with cold efficiency. From the windswept coasts of Britannia to to the dense forests of Germania, Rome's legions held the line against restless tribes, whose names flickered in and out of Roman records like shadows at the edge of the known world. In these northern wilds, the empire's ambition met the raw spine of Europe, a land where winter devoured armies, rivers swallowed ships, and forests concealed men who answered to no emperor. The Romans called them barbarians, a single word for dozens of peoples: the Chatti, the Cherushi, the Marcomanni, the Frisians, the Angles tribes whose language, kinship ties, and shifting loyalties defied neat maps. They were farmers, hunters, cattle thieves, oath breakers, and oath keepers in equal measure. Some traded with Rome, some took her coin. Some bled her border guards dry in a rain of javelins and ambushes. For centuries, the Roman frontier pulsed like a wound that refused to heal. The Rhine and the Danube marked the trembling edges of Roman order. Stone fortresses rose from the soil, watchtowers studded the roads, wooden palisades bristled above river crossings. Behind those walls, legionaries drilled. Local auxiliaries sharpened spears, and merchants bartered iron, amber, and fur. Yet beyond the line in the black forests and mist-thick marshlands, Rome's reach thinned to nothing. There, power belonged to the land and to the men who understood it. Chieftains who held no parchment titles, but commanded loyalty through gift and blood. Wise women who traced runes in ash and bone. Blacksmiths who were part craftsman, part priest, hammering cold iron into more than a blade, a charm against darkness, a promise of strength. In these centuries, the honest Twund, Thread the tribes pressed Rome in waves. One generation might sell sons to the legions as mercenaries. The next might rise in revolt, torching forts and slaughtering tax collectors. In the year 9 CE, 3 Roman legions vanished into the Teutoburg forest, swallowed whole by Germanic warriors who used their home ground as shield and sword alike. The bones of that disaster haunted every general who marched north after. But among all these peoples, scattered along the North Sea's shifting coasts and the ice-bound inlets of the Baltic, there dwelt smaller clans overlooked in Rome's records, half-glimpsed in traders' tales and the wary gossip of soldiers posted to the cold ends of the empire. They were not yet Vikings. That word Vikinger would come later, born from raiding and ocean salt, but their roots stretched back through kinship lines older than Rome's marble walls. They were the Seed tribes, the Geats, the Swedes, the Danes, the Northmen of the fjords and the islands. They raised cattle on thin, stubborn soil. They fished herring from rough seas. They farmed small plots hemmed by forests, so dense they seemed alive. Winters were brutal judges. A single bad harvest could kill half a clan. They learned early that survival depended on cunning hands and iron that did not fail. Roman traders knew of them only by rumour, silent men in small boats who sometimes appeared on the horizon, exchanging furs for beads, amber for silver coins stamped with Caesar's face. Sometimes they came as merchants, sometimes as thieves. Sometimes the difference was a single arrow loosed in the night. Rome saw these people as backward, half-formed poor cousins to the larger Germanic tribes that already strained her borders. But buried in these outlands lay iron, hidden in peat bogs, riverbeds, and marshy soil. This was not the iron of Rome's organised forges, smelted in city foundries by slave labour. This was a raw, local or cold bog iron, heavy with secrets. The blacksmiths of the north learned to coax that iron into something purer than Roman steel. Slowly, across generations, they guarded the secrets of the heat, the fold, the water quench under winter moon. They learned that a blade could be more than metal. It could be a talisman, an oath, a thing with spirit enough to outlast the man who carried it. While Rome flexed its legions and paved its roads across Europe, the ancestors of the Norse watched, waited, learned. They traded for Roman silver, stole Roman mail shirts, examined Roman blades. Then they made something different, a slender secret hidden in the folds of the northern fog. The empire would discover it the hard way, when the first coastal settlements burned and the first legionaries found their shields split clean by steel that should not have existed. The edge of Rome's world was never a straight line. It bled outward in broken roads and lonely watchtowers, timber forts and bristling palisades that trembled under the weight of forests too vast to tame. Along the windswept shores of the North Sea and the narrow inlets of the Baltic, Rome's reach flickered like a dying lantern, bright on a map, but weak in the cold mist where the northern tribes gathered. It was here, on these shifting coastlines, that the first whispers of the secret blade began. Not in grand battles, but in the small encounters: a merchant ship gone missing, a fishing village burned to its pilings, a Roman tax collector found dead in the marshes, throat opened by a blade no local blacksmith could have forged. The Roman garrisons called these raiders piratai. Pirates, a word borrowed from the Greeks, but reshaped by cold salt winds. They were not yet the great dragon-headed fleets of later centuries. These were small bands, cousins, sons, outlaws, and hungry farmers who lashed together boats when the harvest failed. They rowed narrow craft through marsh channels, slipped across the Baltic's grey waters under low cloud, landing where the empire least expected and least defended. No grand king ordered these raids. They were not Rome's Germanic foederati tribes paid in gold and trade for their loyalty. They were something older, looser free clans, bound by kin, revenge, and survival. The Roman chroniclers struggled to name them: Saxons, Dani, Geatas, but these names blurred and shifted. The reality was messier. A village of farmers could become pirates overnight if the winter's stores rotted or a feud needed silver to settle. And when they came, they struck with an edge Rome did not yet understand. Picture a coastal Roman villa on the Frisian shore, a broad-beamed house, Roman tiles shipped north at ruinous cost, a garrison of local auxiliaries dozing in the half-dark. Sails appear on the horizon, not square-rigged Roman merchant sails, but low, rectangular sheets of wool soaked in fish oil. A handful of boats slide up the mudflat at dawn. Before the guards can rouse the villa's steward, the outbuildings are in flames. A century later, this scene would be called a Viking raid, a word to haunt monasteries from Lindisfarne to Paris. But here, in these early centuries, it was something else. The raw rehearsal of a new kind of warfare. Among the loot these early raiders prized most were Roman blades, short gladii, spatha, fine helmets, shield bosses. But in the hidden forges of their homelands, the Norse ironworkers studied them with cold eyes. They learned what the Romans did not do: how to draw the blade longer without snapping its spine, how to fold the iron and burn away the impurities in the bog ore, how to add carbon, quench it quick in icy streams, and polish the edge until it gleamed with the faint sheen of water ripples. So in the half-forgotten trade posts where Roman traders came to barter amber and furs, whispers spread. They told of narrow blades that did not shatter on Germanic spears. They spoke of knives that cut clean through bronze buckles and iron mail alike. Some laughed rumour and superstition, they said, but a legionary's corpse on the marsh path said otherwise. The empire did not fall overnight. The legions did not flee at the first clash. They fought, as they always had, with discipline, formation, and faith in iron law. But on cold nights in the border forts, the veterans spoke of a blade that gleamed like a mirror in the moonlight etched with runes they could not read, swung by men whose cloaks were lined with wolf fur and whose eyes reflected the northern aurora. At first, these stories seemed nothing more than frontier superstition. Yet, as the decades passed, the small raids grew bolder. A Roman supply ship ambushed in the Elbe estuary. A grain convoy lost off the Danish coast. Settlements forced to pay tribute in silver and iron ore, just to be spared the torch. Each raid carried home more than loot. It carried the Empire's own metal raw iron, better ore, scraps of captured gear. In hidden longhouses and blackened forges deep in pine forests, Norse smiths fed Roman iron into the heart of the secret, refining their technique, honing the blade that would one day earn a name inscribed in the metal itself, Ulfbert. The Romans did not yet know what this word meant, but soon they would see its edge gleam through fire and frost a warning that the North had learned, watched, and now would teach terror in return. The Roman Empire was built on the art of fear. Legionaries drilled for years to stand unmoved behind their shields, to hold the line when the ground shook with charging barbarians. Their discipline broke tribes like waves on stone. Their roads and forts stitched Europe together with the promise that no enemy could outrun the eagle's wings. And yet, at the ragged edges of that vast power, the legions feared one thing above all else: what they could not see coming and what they could not control once it appeared. For centuries, the Roman way of war relied on order, shield walls, spear thrusts in tight formation, cavalry sweeping wide to flank and crush. Against this, the scattered tribes of the north often stood no chance in open battle. But the forests were not open fields. The marshes were not Rome's sunlit roads. And in that broken country, the neat logic of the legion faltered. Roman historians, from Tacitus to Ammianus Marcellinus, record the same terror in different words. The moment when the shield wall fails, when the terrain turns traitor, when the fog rolls in, when the enemy comes not as a line, but as a whisper and a sudden roar. The Norse, like their Germanic cousins, understood this weakness. They did not seek to match Rome rank for rank. They found the gaps, the soft places. They learned the sound of Roman boots on frozen leaves, the creak of leather armour, the way an armoured column must slow to cross a bog or ford a stream. They studied the cold more intimately than any senator ever would. But what truly chilled the Roman spine was not just the ambush, it was the rumour of what these men carried when they struck. At first, the Empire's generals scoffed at the notion that these northern raiders had better blades. Surely these were crude iron bands, roughly hammered by smoky peat fires. How could peasants and fishermen rival the output of Roman foundries that armed entire legions? But time and again, patrols returned with horror on their lips, if they returned at all. Auxiliary scouts spoke of warriors whose blades sliced through mail shirts, forged in Ravenna or Mainz. Merchants whispered that some northern blacksmiths were no mere craftsmen, but keepers of secrets older than Rome's temples, forging iron with rituals under new moons, folding metal by hand and prayer. When Rome did recover a fallen sword from the raiders, what they found disturbed them. The blade was longer than a gladius, narrower than the heavy spatha used by the cavalry. It was balanced, keen-edged, and above all, unnaturally pure. There were no slag lines to catch and crack, no flaws to weaken the spine. Some bore inscriptions no Roman scholar could read: strange crosses, runes that seemed half Latin, half arcane. This was not mass production, it was hidden mastery. And what Rome feared most was that it could not be copied at scale. Their own smiths tried. They melted, folded, quenched, tempered, but the secret held fast in northern hands. The legionary shield wall depended on predictability. Each man trusted the strength of his shield boss, the reliability of his mail. When an enemy blade could slip through both, panic spread faster than any barbarian charge. And when panic took root, the line broke, and with it, the illusion that Rome's border was ironclad. Consider the outpost forts along the lower Rhine, small garrisons cut off by dense forests and winding rivers. If the signal fire failed, if the scouts vanished in the mist, 100 men might stand alone against 30 shadows, armed not just with crude axes, but with blades that cut like the cold wind itself. To a Roman soldier far from home, that fear was worse than any open battlefield. You could not negotiate with shadows. You could not bribe the frost. And when that secret edge gleamed in the torchlight, narrow, rune-marked, glinting with the blood of comrades, it carried a truth the Empire hated to admit. The frontier was never truly theirs. It belonged, in the end, to the men who knew how to disappear into the pines and return with iron that no Roman smith could master. And they brought with them not just war, but the promise that the North would shape the fate of the South, one hidden blade at a time. Long before the word Viking carved its rune into the fear of Europe, a quiet revolution was taking shape in the shadowed forests and wind-swept coasts of the North. It did not begin in the war cry of a raider or the clash of shield against shield, but in the steady rhythm of hammer on iron, deep in the heart of a blackened forge. Picture a coastal farmstead near what we now call Jutland, sometime in the 3rd century. Winter has come early. The fields lie hard under frost. The cattle are thin. Inside, a timber workshop built half below ground to shield against the wind. An old man and his son stand over an earthen furnace. Sparks bloom in the darkness, lighting the lines on the father's face. His hands, black with soot, move with the precision of generations. They are not blacksmiths in the Roman cent-state employees, forging standardized swords by the hundreds for the legions. These men are part craftsman, part keeper of a secret. To them, iron is not just ore dug from bogs and riverbeds. It is something alive, something that demands respect, cunning, and ritual. The ore itself is humble lumps of iron-rich earth, lifted from bogs in autumn when the ground is soft. In Rome, this would be slag, worthless compared to the organised mines of Spain or the black pits of Britannia. But the North does not obey Rome's measures of worth. Here, the secret is not the ore, but the patience. In the forge's belly, charcoal burns hot and hungry. The sun works the leather bellows, driving air until the furnace glows white. The father chants a quiet prayer to the spirits of the land, not to Jupiter or Mars, but to old powers with no Latin name. With a crooked stick, he draws a protective rune in the ash. When the ore melts, it weeps a bloom of raw iron stubborn, flecked with slag, brittle if mistreated. It must be hammered while still hot, folded again and again on the anvil's back. Each blow drives out impurities. Each fold tightens the grain of the metal. A poor blacksmith makes a plough blade in a day. A master makes a sword in weeks. What emerges under these hidden hammers is no mere tool. It is leaner than the Roman gladius, longer than the Saxon seax. Balanced for both cut and thrust, its narrow point and straight edges give it a quiet, lethal grace. More than that, it holds an edge that Roman steel cannot match. When cooled in the water of a nearby stream bitter cold from melting snow, the blade shudders, hardens, and locks its secret inside. Some say the water matters as much as the forge. The iron takes on the soul of the land it passes through. Some say the chants matter more binding spirit to steel warding off misfortune that might twist the blade in battle. By dawn, the blacksmith's hands ache. He dips the blade in oil, polishes it with fine sand, tests it against a strip of boar hide. The cut is clean. The blade hums when struck, a thin song that carries through the frost-heavy trees. The boy watches, wide-eyed. He has seen Roman blades, traded by wandering merchants, or torn from dead auxiliaries near the frontier forts. They are heavier, thicker, mass-forged for the masses of men Rome throws at its enemies. But this blade feels different. It is not for a rank of faceless soldiers. It is for a chieftain, for a man who stands alone at the front of his kin, for someone whose name must echo in the sagas when he is gone. The father shows him the small punch marks, along the fuller, a secret signature. Not yet Ulfbert that name would come in time, carved like a whispered oath into the spine of a new age. For now, it is only a mark passed from father to son, smith to apprentice, a promise that this knowledge, this iron truth, must never slip into foreign hands. Beyond the forge, the wind hisses through the pine trees. Somewhere far south, Roman soldiers light signal fires along the limes, boasting that no tribe can stand against them. They do not yet know that in a hidden hut, by firelight and the hush of falling snow, a secret has been born that steel alone cannot break. When the snows thaw and the boats slip from their winter cradles back into the sea, these blades will go with them, strapped to the belts of men who fear no emperor. They will cut more than flesh. They will cut into Rome's certainty that the world beyond its walls is nothing but darkness. And in that cut, the north will find its power. In the north, the line between craftsman and conjurer was thin as the edge of a blade. To forge iron in a land where the soil froze half the year, where the forests swallowed the unwary, was not merely labour, it was a negotiation with unseen forces. And those who struck that bargain were more than blacksmiths. They were keepers of the threshold between the earthly and the hidden. They were the blacksmith shamans. In Roman cities, the forge was a trade guild, a place of noise and smoke tucked in the back alleys of empire. But in the north, the forge was closer to a shrine, a low hut of timber and turf, half buried in earth to trap the heat, marked not just a workshop, but a sacred space. It was here, in the dance of sparks and the hiss of quenching water, that iron met spirit. Across the fjords and forest settlements, certain families were known for their iron. Their names might not appear in the sagas alongside kings and jarls, yet their influence lingered in every blade drawn in vengeance, every spear point thrust in battle. They were remembered in whispers, the smiths whose hammers could tame brittle bog ore, whose breath of words over cooling steel could bind luck into a warrior's hand. When a young smith was first apprenticed, he did not begin with iron. He began with stories tales of how the first smiths stole the secret of fire from the deep earth, how they learned to read the veins of the land like runes. He learned the taboos. Never forge a blade on certain nights when the moon is black. Never quench steel in standing water where spirits sleep. Never sell a blade to a man whose cause is dishonourable. Break the bargain, and the iron would betray you. On the walls of these hidden forges hung charms of antler, scraps of cloth, carved runes for protection. Beneath the anvil, sometimes, a burial, the bones of a bird, the skull of a bear cub, offerings to whatever spirits guarded the hammer's arc. The Roman soldier might mock such superstition, but a Norse chieftain knew better. He would not trust a blade from a man who did not keep these rites. It was said that some smiths were seedsmen men who knew the deeper magic, a shadow cousin to the seeress women who read the threads of fate. They could whisper a curse into the hot spine of a sword, binding it to its owner's bloodline. They could turn iron brittle with a glance, or harden it beyond anything the Empire's foundries could birth. The process itself was half craft, half right. The smith chose the ore with care. The best iron came from certain bogs fed by streams rich in minerals, marked with standing stones older than any village. Charcoal was burned from particular woods, birch for hardness, alder for flexibility. The folding and hammering was done in silence, save for the chant of the bellows, the low hum of the forge fire-eating air. When the blade neared completion, the smith might call the patron to stand beside him. A warrior's sweat mixed with the final quench, his breath sealing the edge to his own fate. To lose such a blade was to lose part of one's luck. To have it stolen was a shame almost too heavy to bear. Some blades were marked plainly across, a single rune. Others carried words no Roman or Christian priest could decipher. Ulfbert, Ingelry, strange echoes of names or lineages. A code hidden in iron that even today puzzles archaeologists. Legends grew in the longhouses after raids. How a single blade turned aside 3 Roman spears in a night battle near the Saxon shore. How a chief's sword, lost in a river during a storm, turned up a generation later in the hands of his grandson, the edge still sharp as a wolf's tooth. Such tales were not idle. They were proof that these blades were not simply tools of war, but living symbols, an unbroken line of skill and spirit that bound the cold forges of the north to the fear that crept into Rome's stone-built halls. In the smoke and hiss of these hidden huts, the north wove its secret. While the empire relied on iron mined by slaves, smelted by men who never touched a battlefield, the blacksmith shamans forged each blade as if it were a companion for the warrior's soul, a brother in iron, born of fire and cold stream. When the day came that the longships slipped down frozen rivers toward the empire's coasts, these blades would be more than steel. They would be the sharp edge of the north's defiance, and the ghost Rome could never lay to rest. It would take centuries for the word Viking to echo like a war horn across the coasts of Europe, but the blade that carried their secret was already carving its legend into the bones of the Roman frontier. And no name is spoken more often when historians trace this legend than the word etched into iron itself, Ulfbert. To a Roman scribe, the name meant nothing, a jumble of foreign letters hammered into the fuller of a sword. But to the Northmen who held it, and the foes who fell before it, Ulfbert was more than a name. It was a whisper of something uncanny, a weapon born centuries ahead of its time. More than 170 of these blades have been found buried in riverbeds, pulled from muddy banks, or laid to rest beside warriors under grassy burial mounds from Britain to the Volga. Each bears the same enigmatic inscription, plus Ulfbert, plus sometimes clear as a chisel's bite, sometimes half faded by rust and centuries of sleep in wet soil. What does it mean? Some believe Ulfbert was a man, a master smith, whose skill was so great that generations after him forged in his name, marking blades like seals of secret quality. Others argue it was not a man, but a mark of a clan, a family of smiths whose knowledge passed like hidden runes from father to son. A few suggest it was a hidden forge on a fjord's edge, or deep in the pine-dark forests, where iron flowed not from crowded Roman mines, but from the swampy veins of the land itself. Whatever its origin, the blades marked with Ulfbert were something Rome did not expect. Their steel was so pure that modern metallurgists compare it not to the soft iron typical of the early medieval world, but to crucible steel made centuries later in distant lands like Persia or India. The carbon content was unusually high, hardened enough to hold a killing edge, but flexible enough not to snap when a shield clashed or a mailcoat caught a blow. How did Norse blacksmiths, working in cold forest forges with peat bog ore, achieve this? Some believe they rediscovered an ancient method lost to the Roman world, the secret of controlling carbon, by folding and remelting small blooms of iron again and again until the metal's impurities vanished like smoke. Others suspect they traded for raw steel ingots brought by daring merchants along the rivers from the east, perhaps even smuggled crucible steel from Persia, carried by traders who crossed half the known world for furs and walrus ivory. Yet this was more than technology. A Roman spatha or gladius was a soldier's tool, hammered by the hundreds to arm anonymous ranks. But an ulfbert was different. It was a blade made not for a common warrior, but for a man whose name would be sung in the mead hall, a chieftain, a war leader, an oath brother of jarls and kings. To hold one was to wield more than steel. It was to carry the hidden power of the north, the promise that no matter how far south Roman rule reached, there was always a cold edge waiting beyond the forests. Archaeologists find them in the strangest places. One rests at the bottom of the River Thames, lost perhaps in a panicked flight from raiders or a final battle on London's early banks. Others lie beneath ancient bridges in Germany, left as offerings or hidden by warriors who never return. In Norway and Sweden, they are unearthed from graves lined with birch bark and fur weapons wrapped for the long sleep beside men whose deeds outlived their flesh. Some of these blades are perfect. Others are crude forgeries, false ulfberts made by smiths who hoped to imitate the name but lacked the secret to make the steel true. Even in their own age, the ulfbert was a thing worth copying, counterfeiting, stealing. A mark that could strike fear on sight or turn a poor man's blade into a talisman if he could pass it off as the real thing. When a Roman patrol recovered a fallen ulfbert from a slain raider, it was more than a spoil of war. It was a puzzle they could not solve. For all their roads, their forges, their empire, fed by slave labour and iron veins, they could not replicate the purity bound into that narrow blade. So the mystery spread from Roman forts on the Rhine to the whispered warnings in distant monasteries. Beware the men who come from the sea, clad in fur and iron, bearing swords that gleam like the cold stars. The name Ulfbert was never spoken in a Roman Senate hall, but in the frozen pine forests where the blacksmith shamans worked under flickering torchlight, that word punched in iron, hidden under runes, was a promise that the North would never bow to any empire that could not match its secret steel. A blade alone does not make fear. It must be wielded by men who understand what terror does to the human heart, and few learned this lesson better than the early Norse raiders who carried the secret steel to Rome's trembling borders. By the time the first Ulfbert blades glinted in the dawn fog of the North Sea coasts, the shape of the raid had already become legend. It was not the thunder of armies. It was not columns of banners or siege engines trundling across stone roads. It was shadows, water, and silence, followed by fire and the sudden ring of steel. Picture a lone monastery perched on an island shore, a Roman outpost turned Christian beacon, its stone walls holding little more than prayers, relics, and a hoard of silver cups that glowed, like promises in the eyes of men who had never bent a knee to Rome's new god. At low tide, the Norse boats slip from the river mouths and drift under sail until the first bell of matins echoes over the surf. There is no war horn, only the creak of oars and the soft slap of water against hulls carved from pine and oak. Then boots in the shallows, a dozen men, 30 men, never enough to face a legion in open ground, but more than enough for monks and a handful of half-armed sentries. In that moment, the secret blade comes alive. The Norse do not carry it sheathed, like a Roman officer's parade sword, gleaming for show. They carry it wrapped in fur against salt spray, oiled and ready, its edge the hidden promise of what happens when iron and fear meet. They strike at doors, splintering them with axe heads first. But when the guards scramble in confusion, they draw the long blades longer than a gladius, faster than a spather in close quarters. One swing shears a spear halved in two. Another bites through wool tunic and rib. The steel does not chip, does not bend, does not fail. In the chaos, a young monk flees down a cloister. He glances over his shoulder and sees it. The blade gleaming in the half-light, runes catching the dawn like frost. Later, when he survives to stammer out the tale in a far monastery, he will swear the raiders' swords were unlike any iron a Christian blacksmith could forge, that they cut through helmet and mail as if they were parchment. This was how the Norse used the secret steel, not as a line weapon, not in massed formations like the disciplined Roman shield wall, but as the silent edge of a new kind of war. Fast, surgical, psychological. The men who carried these blades were often not kings or jarls, but the trusted chosen of a chieftain's hearthband young cousins, sworn brothers, the restless second sons with nothing but courage and an oath to prove. They trained for speed, not heavy armour. The blade's balance let them shift from shield to sword in the same breath to parry, slash, turn the fight sideways before the enemy's heavier iron could swing back. When word spread of the steel, its power multiplied itself. Rumour grew teeth sharper than any edge. A farmer on the Northumbrian coast, waking to see sails on the horizon, did not think rough pirates. He thought the blade that cannot break. The monks on Iona, on Lindisfarne, on the Frankish coast, whispered of blades inscribed with demon marks that Roman iron could not stop. And the more the rumour spread, the more it became true. Fear made a man drop his spear. Panic turned a line of defenders into a herd running for the trees. Against peasants and poorly armed watchmen, the Norse raiders rarely needed to test the blade's full strength, but when they did, it held. The secret steel-shaped tactics, too. A chieftain who owned even a handful of these blades could send his best men first, cutting deep into an enemy's line, splitting shield and morale alike. Once the first gap opened, the axes and spears followed cheap weapons, yes, but now driven by the sudden terror that the Northmen's edge could not be matched. Some Ulfbert blades became trophies, traded back into Roman hands, hung in garrisons as grim evidence of the frontier's danger. Some vanished, with their wielders under the surf when storms smashed longships against hidden reefs. Others returned home, blade and bearer alike blooded with silver and stories that fed the next raid, the next forging, the next generation that would carry the same edge south. In this way, the Norse did not need armies of 10,000. They needed only shadows, sails, cold water, and the secret blade that could turn a handful of hunters into ghosts the Empire could not catch. Not every Roman who faced the northern blades perished on a frozen shore or bled into a marshy ditch. A few survived, carried scars home like brands, silent witnesses to a threat their generals often refused to see until it was too late. One such voice lives on in a fragment of parchment, half burned, its Latin words smeared by age and damp. Scholars debate its truth, but its terror rings clear the testimony of Gaius Livius Varro, a centurion once stationed at a lonely outpost on the empire's northern fringe. He writes, "We thought them peasants. Ragged fishermen turned thieves. Not soldiers, never soldiers. They came by night, in boats small as a tavern's roof, silent as the moon crossing the sky. By dawn, we were unmade. Varro had commanded 50 men on the Rhine frontier, veterans and raw recruits, a ragged mix of local auxiliaries and Roman-born legionaries sent north as punishment or test. They drilled by day, patrolled the woods by torchlight, rebuilt the same timber palisade each spring when frost and rot chewed it to pieces. For most, it was a dull post, a place for discipline to soften, for boots to wear thin, and hopes to drift southward to warmer postings. But in the winter of his account, the outpost lay on the edge of something changing. Rumours spoke of coastal villages robbed of iron tools, of fishing hamlets burned, of merchants refusing to travel certain forest roads without armed escort. The locals muttered of new blades, longer, keener, blessed by spirits that laughed at Roman mail. Varro did not believe it until the dawn it came to his gate. "We heard the geese first," he writes. "Always the geese. They wake before any man does when trouble walks in darkness." At the watchtower, the sentry's shout was swallowed by the crack of timber. Shadows slipped over the low wall, too quick for the lumbering guards half-armed with spathers still sheathed. The first clash was not a clash at all. It was the hiss of steel-biting leather, the wet gasp of a throat opened by iron. Varro fought as his oath demanded. He drove his short gladius against a figure cloaked in wolf. Fur felt the jolt as his Roman steel struck something that did not give. He pulled back in disbelief, his blade's edge chipped, jagged as glass. The raider's sword gleamed in the torchlight, narrow, rune, marked, its point untouched by the clash. It turned aside Varro's parry like it was a child's toy. They moved as hunters do. Varro's words bleed through centuries. Not as soldiers, no ranks, no horns. A nod, a gesture, and the blade was where my shield was weakest. He survived only by blind fortune. A collapsing palisade gave him cover to crawl into the underbrush, his arms split to the bone. He watched as the raiders vanished into the trees before Roman reinforcements could arrive, slipping away like smoke, leaving the fort's supplies stripped, the gate charred, the dead half buried in snow. When Varro's report reached his commanding tribune, the word Ulfbert was scrawled in the margin by some later hand a clue, a rumour. The name did not appear in Rome's official dispatches, but it lingered among frontier gossip. The centurion's fragment ends with a single line, half curse, half confession. "Send more men if you wish. Send stronger walls if you must. But when the blade comes again, it will not break as ours do." Remember this. It was the whisper that haunted the legion camps for decades. The old veterans spoke of it to the new recruits, who laughed at first. But in the dark watches of the night, every soldier knew, all the discipline in the world means little if the iron in your hand cannot match the edge that waits in the pines. The North had found its terror not in numbers, but in the secret, a blade that could outlast the Empire's boast of invincibility. And in voices like Varro's, that truth bled south, carried by men who had seen the ghost edge gleam in the frost and lived to warn Rome that the frontier was cracking, one perfect cut at a time. If the legions had cared to look beyond the burning coasts and stolen silver, they might have found the heart of their fear buried, not in the warbands, but in the black soil itself where the North hid its oldest gift, iron, raw and stubborn, sleeping in the cold bogs. Unlike the Empire's vast open pit mines, worked by slaves, ore broken by pick and packed by mule train to smelting towns, the iron of the North was drawn from places the Romans deemed too poor to bother. Marshy ground, peat bogs, riverbeds where the water ran red with trace minerals. Each spring, when the ice melted and the land turned soft underfoot, the villagers of the north walked the bogs to gather it. Small clumps of reddish, sponge-like ironstone, iron pan, and bog ore, lifted from the mud with wooden spades. They called it mermalm, swamp metal. To a Roman eye, it was worthless dross, but to a people who had learned to see hidden veins where the empire saw nothing, it was treasure. What made it potent was not the ore alone, but what the blacksmiths did with it. Across the fjords and inland forests, they built clay bloomery, furnaces, squat, beehive-shaped towers of earth and stone, fed with charcoal, fanned with bellows worked by hand and foot. The furnace roared, the charcoal hissed, the bog ore bled its secret in heat. Unlike Roman furnaces, which melted huge quantities at once, the Norse bloomeries worked small and precise. Each smelt gave a single bloom, a rough, spongy chunk of iron, heavy with slag. In unskilled hands, this would make a nail, a hinge, a farm tool. But in the right hands, a shaman-smith's hands, it would become something else entirely. The bloom was refired, folded on the anvil, hammered to drive the impurities out. Time and again, under sparks and prayer, the iron was made to kneel. A good smith knew, when the metal sang, the dull note that told him when to fold, when to quench, when to strike true. A poor blow could crack the spine. Too cool, the steel was weak. Too hot, the carbon fled like a ghost. Where did they learn this? No Roman record tells. Perhaps it was old instinct, old whispers passed from one snowbound generation to the next. Perhaps it was stolen knowledge from Scythian traders, Persian merchants, some hidden link across the steppes where men had learned to make crucible steel before Europe dreamed of such purity. Or perhaps it was simply necessity. In a land where winter could kill a man faster than any enemy, tools could not fail. A broken axe in January was a death sentence. A blade that dulled too soon meant no meat in the larder when the herds fled. Iron that could endure frost, hard bone, and battle that was worth more than any Roman coin. When the bog iron's blood met fire, the smith gave it shape. A long, narrow blade, a fuller down the spine to lighten the weight. Sometimes inlaid with a line of twisted steel pattern welding, a dance of iron and carbon that gave strength, flexibility, and a beauty that gleamed like water ripples in torchlight. To the Romans, the result was almost alchemy. When legionaries recovered these blades after a clash, they puzzled at the purity. How could these marshland peasants do what the empire's forges did not? They tested, melted, cast, but the secret slipped away, because the secret was not scale, but attention. Not 1,000 blades stamped identical, but one blade, folded until it answered only to its bearer's hand. Even the quench was legend. Some claimed the smiths used icy river water, chanted runes as they plunged the hot steel. Others said they cooled the blades in oil mixed with herbs and animal blood, that the spirit of the hunt, the sacrifice, passed into the edge. Tales told of boars slain and bled into the quenched trench, of young warriors who stood beside the forge, letting drops of their own blood touch the blade so that iron and man would be bound. Perhaps myth, perhaps truth. But when the blade met Roman iron, the result was real enough. Legionary mail split, shields cracked, spears knocked aside as the Norse edge slipped through what should have been Rome's guarantee of survival. The bog iron did not make empire. It made independence, a promise buried in swamp soil, born anew every time a young smith gathered lumps of mud-red ore in the thaw of spring. And when the longships glided through moonlit rivers, that promise came with them, a secret forged in places Rome never dreamed to look, carried on the belts of men who would remind the empire that not all iron is equal. and not every blade bows to the eagle's standard. The Roman Empire prided itself on absorbing the best of every land it touched. Roads, aqueducts, siege engines, catapults, armour, wherever a clever mind or a sharper blade appeared beyond its borders, Rome found a way to claim it. But in the cold bogs of the north, the empire met a secret it could not swallow whole. After the first coastal raids left garrisons in ruin, legion officers recovered what fragments they could: broken helmets, scorched planks from boats, and, if they were lucky, a blade or two abandoned in the mud when a raider fell. These relics were carried south, like trophies and puzzles both. What metal could slice Roman mail so clean? How could half-wild tribes hammer out steel purer than the state forges at Mainz, Aquileia, or Ravenna? Rome set its best metallurgists to the task. Blades were cracked open, cross-sections polished, and peered at through primitive magnifying glasses. The answer always returned the same. The steel was different. Fewer impurities, more carbon, stronger edge retention. The secret lay not in some magic mineral unknown to Rome, but in how the iron was coaxed into shape, folded, refolded, quenched cold, polished bright. It should have been simple to replicate, but it was not. Rome's forges were built for scale to clothe legions in thousands of swords, armour plates, and spear tips at once. Slave labour fueled the mines. Huge smelting hearths belched smoke day and night. A single Roman foundry might turn out enough iron for an entire province's garrisons in a season. But the Norse method was not a process fit for armies. It was a ritual of patience, a stubborn dance of small blooms hammered by hands that knew every ripple of heat and spark. To match the quality, Rome would have needed to slow down, to fold each blade by hand, to test the carbon content not by weight, but by the smith's eye and the hum of the anvil when struck just so. To teach an entire class of forge slaves to think like master craftsmen, or to free them altogether and trust them as keepers of a trade secret. Unthinkable in an empire that prized uniformity over the artistry of a single hidden forge. Even when a few forward-thinking generals tried bribing northern smiths, offering citizenship in exchange for secrets the knowledge proved elusive. The forging was only half the craft. The rest lived in the iron veins of the land itself, the bog ore gathered by families who knew which patches gave the best blooms, which streams lent water cold and pure enough for the quench. Outside that soil, the result turned brittle or soft, never quite right. The spirit mattered too, though Rome could never write this in a dispatch. For the Northmen, the blade was bound to story a line, from grandfather to grandson, hammer to hammer, each sword a living witness to the oath of its making. The empire's logic turned men into legions, but the Norse logic turned iron into kin. So the empire tried what it always tried. It taxed the trade, outlawed the export of certain ores, regulated blacksmiths in border provinces. It ordered local chieftains to forbid the sale of blades to raiders, as if the chieftains controlled the hidden forges buried deep in pine forests. When that failed, it turned to brute force. Raiding parties were tracked deeper inland. Suspected forges were burned. Smiths, if captured, were marched south in chains, but once in Roman foundries, they refused to speak, or claimed ignorance, or simply died before revealing the full measure of the craft. And so the pattern remained. Rome had the numbers, the legions, the roads that webbed Europe in stone. But when a Norse longship slipped through the mists at dawn, the Roman iron waiting at the shore often bent, cracked, or failed when that hidden blade struck true. This small advantage, edge against edge, was enough to open a seam in the empire's sense of invulnerability. The legions learned to fear not just the wolf-hide raiders who leapt from the surf, but the promise carried on their hips, that beyond the frontier lay secrets Rome could never force to heal, not with gold, not with crucifixion, not with walls of stone. The bog forges kept their silence. The steel remained pure. And when the eagle banners snapped in the wind at the edge of the northern forests, they snapped just a little more brittle because somewhere, out there, a hidden hammer was already shaping the next blade that Roman iron could not match. Steel alone does not bend empires, but fear does the kind that slips under walls and travels further than any blade can swing. The secret steel of the north became more than a weapon. It became a whisper that grew into a myth that outlived the forts it toppled and the kings who scoffed at northern shadows. It began with rumours carried on the wind that blew south through the border forests. Roman merchants spoke in hushed tones of raiders who wielded blades that sang when they cut through iron. Legionaries who survived night attacks told tales of thin-edged swords that split helmets clean and did not dull against mail. At first, these were dismissed as frontier superstition, the usual panic that comes when half-trained auxiliaries meet determined outlaws. But the stories did not fade. They spread, carried by merchants, deserters, traders who bartered wolf pelts and amber in Roman towns far from the frontier's frost. In the smoky back rooms of taverns, at the edge of the empire, in Londinium, Lugdunum, even Rome itself, the word Ulfbert began to drift from ear to ear. No Roman senator would have spoken it aloud, but soldiers muttered it as they sharpened dull gladii. A word like a threat, a riddle that no imperial decree could silence. The myth grew teeth when Christian monks took up the story. In scriptoria along the Irish coast and the Frankish rivers, they wrote grim lines of invaders, whose swords bore marks of the devil, crosses twisted into runes, iron made unholy by hidden rituals. To the church's mind, no mere pagan tribe could make steel so pure. It must be sorcery. It must be witchcraft, hammered into cold iron. These stories found shape in the old Norse minds too. Around long house fires, children listened as elders told of the secret blades that chose their wielders' swords that brought luck to their clan, or ruin if they fell into unworthy hands. A blade with an oath was more than iron. It was a spirit, as alive as the man who swung it. Some sang of blades quenched in blood, some of swords lost in rivers that whispered in the night, waiting for the right hand to claim them again. The myths crossed borders and centuries. Even as Rome faltered and new kingdoms rose on its broken stones, the ghost of the North steel stalked the minds of those who thought to rule in its place. Frankish kings paid fortunes to buy these swords, or to buy the loyalty of Norse captains who carried them. Monasteries hid silver, not just from Viking ships, but from the runed edges that could slice their gates apart, like rotten wood. What made the myth so powerful was that it was not just a story. Archaeology proves it now in the relics pulled from river mud and burial mounds. Real Ulfbert blades, real iron so clean it humbles modern metallurgists. Each one proof that somewhere, centuries before the world called them Vikings, the North held a secret that Rome's wealth and steel legions could not erase. And like all true myths, the blade's story turned back on itself. To the Norse, it was a symbol of independence iron that no king or bishop could claim fully. To the enemies who faced it, it was a phantom edge in the dark. The fear that in the night, no wall was thick enough, no sword strong enough, to stop the men who came silent and left the dead staring into the dawn. So the myth endured long after the empire's banners fell from wind-battered ramparts. It crossed seas with raiders who would one day be called Vikings. It crept into the sagas, recited on winter nights when storms rattled the longhouse walls, and buried deep in the soil in rivers, bogs, under cairns of mossy stone, it waited for the day when the earth would give it back. Proof that the North's secret edge was never just iron. It was fear, folded into steel. Long before his name would be whispered in coastal villages from the Saxon shore to the river towns of Francia, he was just a boy standing barefoot in the snow, waiting for his father's nod. His name was Eric, son of Skard Ironhand, so called not because Skard fought with iron, but because he forged it. For 3 generations, his family had kept a secret fire alive in a hidden forge on the edge of a black pine forest, where the bog began to breathe out iron each spring. Eric's rite of passage did not begin with a raid, but with the hammer and the coals. He was 16 winters old when Skard brought him into the forge before dawn. The hut was half dug into a hillside, the roof low to trap the heat, the door barred against the wind. Smoke leaked through the turf roof like a ghost. Inside, the fire glowed like a small sun. The anvil waited, scarred by years of blows that shaped the secret blades which men called Ulfbert, though Skard never spoke the word aloud. Eric's hands shook as he pumped the bellows. Sparks hissed against the frost that clung to his hair. Beside him, his father moved like a shadow, steady, silent, the hammer an extension of his arm. He did not speak for the first hour. The iron demanded silence. The bloom rested in the coals, dark red turning white as the fire whispered secrets only the old smith heard. Finally, Skard handed the boy the hammer. One word only, sla, strike. Eric's first blows were clumsy. The iron laughed at him, bending where it should not, spitting sparks at his bare wrist. Skard watched without pity. If the boy could not feel the metal's heartbeat, he would never carry the blade it would become. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Ravens watched from the branches, old omens, the eyes of the gods, or the souls of the restless dead, depending on which elder told the tale. Hour by hour, the bloom surrendered its slag under Eric's strikes. Fold, hammer, turn, quench and lift, heat again. His arms burned, fingers blistered. When he faltered, his father handed him a horn of warm ale, mixed with herbs that dulled the ache and sharpened the mind. By dusk, the rough shape of the blade lay across the anvil. Longer than his forearm, narrow at the point, its spine strong enough to split a shield. Not yet a sword, a promise of one. Skard spoke then, voice low as the fire. This steel is you. If it breaks, you break. If you fear the fire, it will fail you in battle. That night, Eric slept beside the forge. His dreams were a swirl of sparks and frost, the hiss of quenching water and the cold rush of river ice. In the darkness, he heard his mother's voice gone, these 5 winters whisper, that the blade would bear him far from home, but never back unchanged. In the days that followed, Skard showed him the rune punch, the mark that would lie hidden along the fuller. Some families carved their own signs, a wolf's head, a twisted knot, a simple cross to mock the southern priests, who said such iron was pagan sin. Eric chose his own mark, a single line broken in 2, the hunter's path through snow. A promise that no matter how far he sailed, he would find his way back to this forge, to this fire, or he would not return at all. When the blade was quenched in the river that spring, he stood knee-deep in the meltwater, hands raw from holding the hot steel until the final plunge. Some say a drop of his blood touched the water first, a small gift to bind the iron's spirit to his own. When the raiding season came, Eric stood at the prow of his uncle's boat. The blade rested against his hip, hidden in oiled leather. He was no longer just the smith's son, but a man bound to iron. His kin carried axes and spears, cheap and brutal, but he carried the edge that would slip through Roman iron like wind through the pine branches. At the first clash on the Saxon coast, Eric learned the truth of his father's words. A Roman auxiliary lunged with a heavy spather, a blade meant for formation fighting, for discipline and order. Eric's blade was faster, lighter, alive in his grip. One slip under the man's guard, one twist of the wrist, and Roman iron clanged uselessly on wet sand, while the secret steel found its mark. After the battle, the elders counted the silver, the furs, the hostages. Eric counted only the notches on his blade, none deep enough to matter. It would bite again. It would return home with him, or be buried in a river, if he fell, waiting for another hand bold enough to lift it from the cold mud. His right was done. The boy had become the blade, and the blade would become the story that carried the North's secret edge deeper into the Empire's trembling dreams. To the Roman mind, a sword was iron, nothing more. A tool of empire, as replaceable as the man who wielded it. But to the Northman, the blade was a companion and a keeper of oaths, a piece of iron so deeply woven into belief that every strike carried the weight of something older than kingdoms. The secret blades, the Ulfberts, and their kin were not finished when the last hammer blow fell. Their real edge was forged in what came next, the runes, the oaths, the blood. When a blade left the smith's hands, it was raw iron made true by fire and patience. But before it was carried across the whale road to strike Roman iron, it had to be bound. This binding was not written down not on scrolls or tablets like Roman decrees, but kept alive in whispered ritual, firelit gestures passed from father to son, mother to daughter, in families where iron was a second kin. In hidden forges, runes were cut into the blade's fuller. Sometimes a single rune, Tivaz, the sign of Tyr, the one-handed god of war and justice. Sometimes a pair, Algiz for protection, and Awaz for the yew tree death and rebirth. These marks were not decoration. They were promises spells to ward off weakness in the metal, misfortune in battle, betrayal by the warrior's own hand. An oath often bound blade to bearer. A young raider might swear over the cooling steel that he would never draw it for a coward's kill, that he would not sell it for silver, nor drop it while blood still warmed his veins. If he broke that oath, the stories said, the blade would turn on him dull in his grip, brittle when he needed its edge most. Some blacksmith shamans whispered that a blade's spirit could taste dishonour. If a coward lifted it, the iron would betray him. A bad cut, a shattered spine, a twist in the clash that left the wielder gut open on the ground. No Roman legionary knew this fear. But in the north, it was spoken around hearth fires, on nights when storms rattled the longhouse roof like the gods themselves pounding for tribute. Blood sealed the pact. A drop from the smith's finger, mixed with soot and oil, might be pressed into the rune marks. A chieftain might nick his thumb and smear the cut along the blade's spine before the first raid. There are tales of darker rites too, an enemy's blood used in the quench trench, or animal sacrifice in spring a goat, a boar its lifeblood poured on the forge stones to feed the steel's hidden hunger. These stories bled into Roman rumour, growing monstrous in the retelling. Christian monks, terrified of runes they could not read, called them devil's marks. Some claimed the Norse poured children's blood into the quench pits, a horror likely born of misunderstanding, but powerful enough to make men shudder at the thought of facing blades that carried curses as sharp as steel. The binding of runes and blood did something subtler too. It made the blade impossible to fully own. A Frankish noble might buy an Ulfbert for a fortune, but if he knew the stories, he would sleep lightly. Was the steel truly his? Or did it carry the whisper of its first oath, ready to slip from his grip when his courage failed? Even the burial of these blades was ritual. When a warrior died, his family often laid the sword beside him in the grave. But sometimes they bent it first, a final breaking that freed the spirit bound to the iron. Bent swords, found in bogs and barrows across Scandinavia, speak of this hush between the living and the dead. The idea that a blade's spirit, unbroken, might rise again if left whole in the dark. Rome could not touch this. It could match iron with iron, fort with fort, law with law. But it could not match belief. The runes, the oaths, the hidden rites that bound Northmen to their blades made the secret steel more than technology. It was identity, the cold edge of a people who did not fear the empire because they trusted the iron that trusted them in return. And when the longships slid from the fog at dawn, those runes glimmering faintly on the blades fuller, a Roman soldier faced not just a sword but a promise that what stood before him would not shatter, would not falter, and would not be bought off by coin or conquest. No wall is high enough to keep out fear when it walks on two legs and rows a shallow boat under cover of mist. And as the Northmen's secret blades found their mark along the edges of the Roman world, the Empire learned this lesson in frost and blood. At first, the raids were treated like an annoyance wild men in small boats, little more than cattle thieves and coastal bandits. Roman commanders stationed on the Rhine or the North Sea coast scoffed at the gossip. A few fishermen with fancy blades could never crack the iron fist of an empire that had broken Carthage and bent the legions of Gaul. But then forts went quiet. A signal fire that should have burned through the night never flickered to life. A tack ship sent downriver vanished with its guard detail weeks later. Its wreck was found beached on a muddy bank, the soldiers inside opened from throat to belly by edges that left clean cuts like a butcher's fresh blade. In the garrison towns, rumours spread faster than any dispatch from the frontier. Officers whispered of patrols found half buried in the snow, shields split down the boss, iron rivets sheared as if they were reeds. Old centurions who had survived Germania and Dacia stared at the edges of their spatha and wondered if they could trust it to hold when the shadows in the forest moved. The fear crept south on merchant tongues. Traders told of village elders on the North Sea coasts, paying tribute to keep the raiders away, bags of iron ore, silver bracelets, cattle handed over not to armies but to bands of men who arrived by night and vanished by dawn. In these villages, some claimed they had seen the secret blades up-close runes, dancing in the torchlight as the Northmen tested their edge on wooden doorposts and the iron hinges of Roman locks. The Empire's answer was the same as it had always been: more men, more forts, more orders from marble halls. New watchtowers rose along muddy roads that led through pine and marsh. Stone signal posts bristled on hills above the rivers. Border lords were commanded to raise local levies, men who farmed by day and patrolled by torchlight at night. But the Northmen knew the land better. They knew where the rivers forked into hidden channels. They learned the rhythms of the new watchposts, which garrison drank more wine than water, which outpost signal fires were damp from the sea winds. When they came where the empire was weakest, at the edges of the map where Rome's roads turned to goat tracks, where the stones of the frontier walls sank into marsh that swallowed all certainty. Sometimes the Romans struck back. A raider's longship might burn on a beach, its crew cut down by a sudden legionary sweep. captured blades were displayed like trophies in the garrison mess halls. But each victory did not calm the border, it only made the fear more tangled. What if the blade was not truly destroyed? What if somewhere in the dark, another blacksmith's hammer was already singing on bog iron to replace it? In the larger towns, Colonia Agrippina, Mogontiacum, Londinium traders, and local lords began to build their own walls higher. Wooden stockades sprouted palisades of sharpened stakes facing the sea. Merchant families stockpiled ransom silver in hidden vaults. Priests led processions along the shorelines, praying for calm seas not to protect fishermen, but to keep the longships from gliding in with the next high tide. And in the barracks, soldiers began to doubt. When a blade fails in the clash, trust fails with it, and the Norse steel did not fail. One story told of a Roman patrol that cornered a band of raiders inland, only to break and scatter when the first shield boss split clean under a single stroke. The survivors swore they saw runes glowing in the frost, marks of a curse as much as craftsmanship. No historian of Rome's decline ever blamed it on a single sword. Empires rot from within, long before a raider's foot crosses the border. But at the ragged edge of the world, where timber forts leaned into winter winds and cold fog swallowed the forest line, the secret steel of the north did what 1,000 foot soldiers could not do alone. It made men wonder if Rome's iron was truly iron at all. And when soldiers wonder, walls crumble. When walls crumble, rumours grow teeth. And so, on the frozen frontiers of Europe, the panic spread carried not just on the clash of steel, but in the hush that came after, when the longships slipped away and the survivors were left to stare at broken shields and wonder when the blade would come again. Long after the last Roman eagle fell from its mast and the legions became ghosts on old maps, the blades that once haunted them did not vanish. They went to sleep buried not in libraries or marble vaults, but in the black soil of the north. For centuries, farmers pushing ploughs through stony fields in Denmark and Sweden struck iron they did not expect. Not rusted nails or simple spearheads, but long blades, so clean and slender that the earth seemed to have preserved them like secrets waiting to speak again. Rivers held them too. The Thames in London, the Rhine in Germany, the slow, dark Elbe, muddy riverbeds gave up blades still marked with runes that no priest or scholar could read. Some swords lay wrapped in rotting cloth. Some were bent, snapped at the hilt, as if to break a spirit that might haunt the living if left whole. Others were thrown in whole, gifts to unseen powers, sunk beneath water that never forgets. Archaeologists puzzled over these finds when the first metal detectors and careful digs of the 19th and 20th centuries brought them back to light. At first, they were thought to be Frankish, maybe forged in distant monasteries or royal courts, but the pattern welding, the carbon purity, the unmistakable +ULF Brat plus mark, punched like an oath into the fuller, told a different story. Some swords emerged from the earth so well preserved that their steel gleamed when polished sharper than iron, forged 1,000 years later in more modern furnaces. The secret steel had slept in peat bogs that sealed away oxygen and decay. The blades lay side by side with iron bosses from shields, with bone combs, with coins stamped with emperors long since turned to dust. In these finds, the truth of the myth is clearer than any monk's terrified letter or Roman dispatch. The North's iron was real, not just legend. And more than that, it was proof that these weapons were never merely tools of slaughter. They were treasures, sometimes buried with chieftains under stone cairns, sometimes sacrificed to the gods in marshes where mist still curls like the breath of spirits at dawn. Consider Salme, an island off the coast of Estonia, where a burial site uncovered 2 Viking ships packed with the bones of warriors. Among the grave goods, iron blades so pure they startled modern metallurgists, blades laid carefully beside men who had died far from home, but were sent to the next world, armed for what waited beyond. Each find is a window into the unspoken code that shaped the North's hidden edge. Some blades show signs of battle nicks and notches where they bit shield or bone. Others are smooth, barely used, perhaps made for the promise of prestige as much as for war. A few bear strange inlays of copper or silver wire, more than practical killing tools. They were statements of identity, status, and faith. What survives in the soil is more than metal. It is the hush that hangs over a peat bog at dawn, the whisper of water closing over a sword offered to the old gods when the raider's work was done. It is the stubborn line of runes along a fuller, the promise that whoever drew this blade once believed in something greater than empire, the power to hold iron to an oath and trust that the steel would answer. Rome's iron crumbled into ruin, its roads cracked, its walls sank into ivy and moss, but the secret blades waited patient beneath the frost. They remind us that the cold truth of the North was never written in marble or parchment, but hammered in heat, quenched in river water, and buried in black earth, until the day we uncovered them again and heard, faintly, the echo of iron that terrified an empire. To the Northmen who carried these secret blades across the misty seas, iron was never just dead metal. It breathed, it remembered. And when drawn in anger or defence, it spoke with a spirit older than any king's decree or bishop's sermon. In the old Norse tongue, a sword was more than a blade. It was a companion with a name, a lineage. The sagas echo with them, Gram, Skofnung, turfing swords that bit so hard they left a mark not just on flesh, but on fate itself. These were not the fanciful relics of bards making poetry. They reflected a truth that lived in every blacksmith's forge and warrior's oath. A good blade carried a soul, and that soul walked with its bearer to shield him or strike him down. When the secret steel came into the world, these lean, narrow swords, whose edges terrified Roman mail, they were folded not just with iron, but with belief. A man who carried such a blade believed it could turn his luck. He wore it not only on raids, but at the Thing, the assembly of free men where disputes were settled by word or, if words failed, by steel. A man's blade hung by his bed while he slept. It lay across his knees in longhouses, where kin gathered to plan raids or swear blood oaths. It crossed the sea with him, wrapped in furs to guard against salt and wet, bound in oil-soaked leather to keep the edge sharp for the hour it was needed most. When Norse seers spoke of fate the word, the threads the Norns wove the blade was part of that weave. If it was made with care, if it was bound with the right runes and quenched in honest blood, it might carry its owner's line forward, father to son, uncle to nephew, brother to brother. A good blade could outlive its first master, passing to the next as more than inheritance as a guardian spirit made iron. But the blade's spirit could turn sour. A broken oath, a dishonoured kill, a coward's retreat could sour the iron. In some tales, a cursed blade found its own way to ruin its wielder, slipping from his hand in battle, dulling at the worst moment, snapping when a man most needed its truth. This is why some swords were buried bent. To break the iron's back was to set the spirit free of final mercy, ensuring that the dead warrior's luck did not haunt the living. Some blades went to the bogs instead. Laid in the dark waters, with other offerings, spearheads, jewellery, animal bones, They sank beneath the peat, where the gods of the land and water were thought to dwell. Even now, when peat cutters in Denmark or Sweden unearth a blade still straight and sharp, it is as if the iron spirit waited, unbroken, beneath the weight of centuries. Among the living, these beliefs shaped how the blades were used. A warrior did not draw his steel lightly. An oath given with sword in hand bound him tighter than any spoken promise alone. To swear on a blade was to tie one's own fate to the sharp mercy of iron. If he lied or broke faith, the blade might betray him, or, so it was said, call misfortune on his kin. When Christian monks wrote of these swords, they described them as enchanted devil's work, bound with runes that mocked the cross. In truth, the Northmen did not see this iron as evil, but as sacred. It was a bridge between the world of flesh and the unseen forces that governed wind, sea, luck, and death. The Romans never understood this. To them, a gladius was a rank mark, a tool mass-forged for men who marched in rows and died in rows. But for the Northmen, each secret blade was an heirloom spirit that turned a single raider into something greater than a man with an axe. It was why a handful of shadows landing on a frozen beach could split an empire's iron shield wall with a blow that felt more like fate than brute strength. When we find these blades today in riverbeds, in peat bogs, in graves lined with birch bark and fir, they still carry that whisper. The spirit does not rust. It waits, patient, the same way it waited in the hand of the man who first drew it from a hidden forge on a winter's dawn. It reminds us that power is not always the weight of legions, but sometimes the quiet bond between a blade and the one who believes it breathes beside him. By the time the first secret blades carved fear into the northern frontier, the Roman Empire was already creaking under its own weight. Borders stretched thin, generals quarrelled, emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Yet still, the legions believed that iron and order could hold back whatever storm gathered beyond the walls. They were wrong. It did not happen in a single night, not one final, roaring clash where the secret steel shattered Rome in a stroke. Decline is never so clean. Instead, it was a slow bleed, 1,000 cuts in the dark forests, raids that came like frost on the spring fields, sudden, unwelcome, unstoppable. At the ragged northern border, the empire built walls and forts that strained to stand against the tide. The limes, timber, palisades, stone towers, signal fires. Legionaries rotated in and out from warmer provinces, their armour battered, their discipline tested by long winters, silent forests, and the rumour of ruined blades that slipped past their shields like ghosts. The last stand came in pieces, scattered skirmishes that bled together into legend. In the late 4th century, as Rome's grip weakened, entire units of Roman auxiliaries, once made up of local tribes paid to fight for the eagle, turned their loyalty elsewhere. Some melted into the woods to join the very raiders they once hunted. A few carried captured Ulfbert blades on their belts, proof that the frontier had changed them more than they had changed the frontier. In some outposts, young officers wrote desperate letters to distant prefects. Send reinforcements, send coin for better walls, send blades that do not snap when they strike northern steel. The answers came too slow. Supply convoys vanished into mist-shrouded marshes. Forts that once sheltered 200 men were left half-garrisoned by a handful of exhausted veterans and local farmhands pressed into service. And when the Northmen came sometimes under the moon, sometimes in broad daylight, when the tide was high, they brought more than axes and torches. They brought the cold promise of steel that had crossed generations and seas. The secret blades slipped through mail and shield, striking panic where once the Roman line had stood unbreakable. One final story remains half fact, half fable, of a Roman commander named Lucullus, said to have faced a band of Northmen who landed on the Frisian coast at dawn. Outnumbered, half his men unarmed after weeks of supply shortages, Lucullus ordered his troops to form a line along a half-frozen embankment. Spears forward, shields braced. The standard of the eagle held high above the slush and frost. When the clash came, it was quiet at first, the hiss of breath, the crunch of boots in icy mud, then the ring of steel, sharp and startling against the dull roar of the North Sea behind them. Lucullus saw the runes first cut into the fuller of a sword that caught the winter sun like a mirror. His own blade, the standard Roman spather, met it once, twice, and shattered like thin ice under a war hammer. By dusk, the standard lay trampled in the churned mud. Lucullus fell, they say, not with a spear through his chest, but from the cold truth that even courage fails when the edge at your throat is stronger than the oath in your heart. In the years that followed, the walls along the limes rotted. The signal fires burned less often. Small towns, once loyal to Roman coin, paid tribute instead to local chieftains, men whose boats slipped between river reeds, carrying the same hidden steel that once turned back the empire's might. Rome's last stand in the north did not end in a single decisive battle. It ended in the silence after empty forts, gates ajar, the echo of footsteps down abandoned roads once paved for legions. In their place came the driftwood skeletons of longships, drawn up on beaches where Roman merchants once traded glass and gold for fur and amber. Where the eagle standard fell, the runed blade rose not to conquer cities in marble, but to remind the world that the North's true power was never its size, but its secret. A promise folded into iron, hidden in bogs, carried across seas by men who feared no emperor, because they trusted the cold edge in their hands more than any law Rome could write. When Rome's borders finally cracked and the eagle standards vanished into ruin and legend, the North did not simply forget the secret that had once slipped past walls and burned outposts in the dark. If anything, the forging of those hidden blades laid the iron spine for what would become the Viking Age, an age when the North rose from mist and myth to carve its mark on the coasts of a crumbling empire. The old forges never fell silent. In the hidden hollows of fjords and the deep pine woods, where families of smiths traced their lineage like chieftains traced theirs in sagas, the hammers rang on iron long after the legions departed. What had once been a whispered craft, known to a few blacksmith shamans, grew into a guarded tradition, no longer just survival, but prestige. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the ships that slipped from Scandinavian shores were no longer small family rafts, hugging coastlines. They were longships, lean, shallow-drafted beasts of oak and pine, built for rivers and open sea alike, and lashed at the belts of the men who stood beneath their dragon-prowed hulls were blades descended from the same secret steel that had terrified Roman sentries a generation before. Some of these blades still bore the name ULF Burt, stamped clearly into the iron, sometimes even in imitation by lesser smiths, hoping to pass off an inferior blade as true. In time, ULF Burt became more than a maker's mark. It became a promise of status. A chieftain would spend a fortune in silver, amber, or raided coin to place one in his son's hand. To carry one was to walk taller in the longhouse, to sit closer to the fire, where raids were planned and oaths sworn. And when these swords went abroad, they carried more than sharp edges, they carried memory. A Frankish monk who glimpsed a blade gleaming on a raider's hip saw not just a thief, but the ghost of Rome's old nightmares. He saw the iron that split shields on the Rhine, the steel that outlasted legions. The legacy of the secret steel shaped more than warfare. It shaped trust among clans. A blade handed down might bind brothers in alliance, seal peace between feuding lineages, or ignite new blood debts if stolen. In some regions, the forging of blades itself became a status sign. A clan might boast that its smiths could rival the famed Ulfbert line, their iron just as pure, their edge just as true. Traders carried stories of the North's iron far beyond Rome's ruins. Along the rivers of Rus, down into the steppe-lands, blades marked with runes turned up in graves 1,000 miles from any Norse fjord. Some likely arrived through peaceful trade, others through the point of a sword at a monastery door. Either way, the mark endured. Modern archaeology shows just how wide that legacy spread. Ulfbert swords have been dredged from the Volga's muddy depths, dug from burial mounds in Ireland and England, unearthed beside hoards of coins minted centuries apart. They appear not only as war prizes, but as heirlooms, proof that the North's steel held value wherever men feared the edge. What began in the cold marshes, iron lumps lifted by hand, folded by firelight, hardened in icy water under whispered prayers, grew into a symbol that outlasted the empire it once cut. It shaped the very idea of what it meant to be Norse. Fierce, yet patient. Practical, yet bound to unseen forces that spoke through runes and oaths. By the time the great Viking fleets thundered up the Seine to Paris, or stormed the coasts of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the secret blade was no longer a whisper. It was the song in the forge, the gleam at a chieftain's side, the promise that the North would carry its iron fear far beyond the old Roman walls, and that in every clash, the hidden knowledge, folded into steel, would remind the world that no empire's iron is safe forever. Long after the last longship's oars fell silent on Europe's rivers, the echo of the North's secret steel has never truly died. It lingers in museum cases, where Ulfbert blades lie under glass, their runes still crisp despite centuries in river mud. It hums in the forge fire of every blacksmith who folds steel by hand, chasing that same elusive perfection that once slipped past Rome's grasp. For centuries, scholars puzzled over these swords. How did a people without Rome's mines, without sprawling cities or vast slave labour, manage to produce metal so pure that modern tests place it closer to high-carbon crucible steel than to the common iron of its age? Some argue the knowledge came from eastward trade Persian steel, reworked by cunning Norse hands. Others believe the secret lay entirely in the bogs and the patient folding, a craft born from watching the land as closely as a hunter stalks his prey. Yet the truth is more than metallurgy. The real legacy of the secret blade is a lesson that no empire can tame all knowledge. Rome, master of roads, armies, laws, failed to break open a handful of hidden forges at Europe's edge. In those lonely huts of turf and timber, blacksmiths whispered oaths to iron, turned marsh mud to steel, and sealed fear into a blade that no legionary formation could fully withstand. When we unearth these swords today, runes gleaming faintly under the conservator's lamp, we glimpse the old fear that Roman soldiers carried in their packs alongside oil and bread, the knowledge that somewhere in the frost-thick pines a blade was being forged that cared nothing for emperors, only for the hand that would wield it. Today, when we speak of Vikings, we remember the dragons carved on ship prows, the raiding fires on monastery shores, the sagas sung long after the storms. But at the heart of that legend lies iron not as brute force alone, but as a secret edge, honed by patience, guarded by belief, wielded by men who trusted their steel more than any treaty or tribute. If you stand beside an Ulfbert now in a glass case at a museum in Oslo or Berlin, at the bottom of an estuary dredged after centuries, you can still see it, the clarity of the blade's core, the runes punched true, the narrow spine that once split Roman iron in the dark. It is a whisper that the land holds its own memories, that the frost remembers secrets even marble walls forget. And so the blade endures, a ghost edge in our stories, a fragment of fear folded into every tale of ships that came at dawn. Proof that sometimes the sharpest blow an empire can suffer does not come from vast armies or golden siege engines, but from a hidden forge, a patient hammer, and a spirit sealed in cold steel that outlasts kings and maps alike. When the North came for Rome, it came not only with wind and wave, but with a secret folded in iron. And though the men who forged it sleep beneath barrows and bogs, their edge still cuts us today, a reminder that no empire, no matter how wide its walls, can ever bury the promise of iron that breathes.